Information overload is a big deal that people won't talk about. And in fact, the reason I wouldn't put this on YouTube publicly is that people would be a little bit snobby about it, right? If you have ever forgotten something in the middle of a shoot, it was probably because of information overload. Whether you're a portrait photographer or a landscape photographer, or you're flying drones, or you're shooting video, you're required to process a lot of information all at once, and it can be really, really overwhelming. And a lot of personality types assume that they are perfect and that they can handle all of this information and process it 100%. And therefore, they would completely reject these notions of information overload and how to handle it. So some of you might struggle with this. Others of you will acknowledge, hey, I've definitely screwed stuff up on a shoot, and that's a problem, and will welcome some information on how to deal with it. So I'm going to talk about what information overload is, how it relates to different styles of photography, and then I'll give you some techniques for dealing with it. First up, consider yourself as a portrait photographer. Portraits involve so many different elements, and if any of them are wrong, it can screw up the portrait. And if you can get them all right, you can produce a much higher quality portrait. So first of all, there's the composition of it. Thinking about, say, what the background looks like. How zoomed in are you? Are you cropping between the joints? Are you showing a full body shot, but you've just clipped into the foot a little bit? What about the angle of the background and the distance to the background? These compositional elements are alone a lot to take in, and well-composed portraits are much, much better than poorly composed portraits. I think we can all agree. With portraits, lighting is another element. Hard light tends to be unflattering on the face, whereas soft light tends to be better, but you want a catch light. You don't want dark shadows under the eyes caused by the light hitting the brow. A nice backlighting is really nice. And if people have dark hair and they're against a dark background, sometimes you need a kicker light. How do you handle just thinking about all the lighting, especially if you're in a studio that might have 3 lights, 4 lights, 5 lights that you need to arrange and perfectly balance? Is the light perfect, or do you need to add a little bit of fill? Either dealing with composition or dealing with the lighting when taking a portrait could easily be overwhelming. So how could a portrait photographer possibly deal with both of those things? Right away, you'd be feeling information overload. But wait, we haven't even gotten to posing yet. The difference between somebody who tilts their head forward or who tilts their head back, who's got their chin smushed in, or who pushes their head out a little bit, these are drastic differences in the posing. And that is just the head. What about a little bit of tilt? What about a little bit of turn? What about the shoulders? Turn to the side or square? Are the shoulders back or are they forward? And oh my God, if you're doing a full length pose where people need to deal with posing the fingers and the hands and the legs and the feet, not to mention the outfit and the clothing, are there any wrinkles in it? Wow, how could you possibly handle all this on top of handling lighting and composition? But now, you get into even more detailed things. Is the makeup on your subject, does it get a little bit smudged? Do they have a little bit of lipstick on their teeth? What if a strand of hair suddenly falls in front of the face? That's hard to remove in Photoshop. It's very time consuming. What about your camera? Is the camera above the eye or slightly below the eye, where it might highlight the area underneath the chin and not be as flattering? Are you using the right f-stop to get the right amount of background blur? Or maybe you need to use a higher f-stop because you need more of their face in focus because there's actually too much background blur. Are your other camera storing settings okay? Is your shutter speed fast enough to really freeze the motion? Is the model holding still? Or maybe you need to use a faster shutter speed to stop a kid from blurring themselves as they kind of bounce around. Oh, and focusing, because it's really critical, especially with shallow depth of field, to focus on the near eye and really nail the focus. I'm listing all this stuff because it's incredibly stressful. People can think of portraits as being easy, and they can think of themselves as a good portrait photographer. But if they think portraits are easy, then maybe it's because they're not fully considering all of these different factors, because how really could you take a portrait if you were really going to set your brain about handling all of these different things? By the time you worked through the list of getting all these things and you got to the final item on the list, maybe the composition changed, maybe the sun moved behind a cloud or something, or maybe the subject managed to actually mess up their own hair or makeup while you were dealing with your camera settings. It's practically impossible. I will have some approaches on how to deal with it, but just looking at portrait photography, one of the top things people do is they have an assistant. If you're on a real photo shoot, then there will be a person, you will have a makeup person, and they will not only put the makeup on the model, but during the shoot, they will be watching the model to make sure that the makeup maintains, because you know what, models sweat, especially under hot lights, and that will change the makeup. So they might need to go in and do some powder, or they might absentmindedly rub their face or rub their eye and screw up their mascara. That needs to go in and be patched. And as a photographer, maybe you can notice that, but maybe you won't. There'll also be a separate hair person who will literally just be watching for a single strand of hair that falls out of place and covers the face. So you might not have a hair and makeup person, but maybe you could grab a friend and say, hey, could you just do me a favor and think only about the model's hair and makeup and clothes and look for little things that might be unflattering? Because I promise you, it's too much for you to take on. It's not. Experience will help with this. But if you're Annie Leibovitz, if you're David LaChapelle, very famous photographers, then they have other people helping with these things. They don't take all this on, and they are some of the best photographers in the world. The most experienced photographers in the world offload some of these tasks. So if you're not the most experienced photographer in the world and you don't have anybody helping you, how can you possibly do it? Well, it's going to be hard, and you really should seek out other people to help. Another way to offset these challenges is to use a professional model, because a professional model takes on a lot of that burden. A professional model can handle posing, and they know, depending on what side of their body they're leaning on, whether they're smushing their body in an awkward way, they know to kind of stretch their back and poke their head out, so you don't have to be thinking about all these things. You don't have to tell them all these things. The relationship between a photographer and a model is a partnership that results in a picture. Sometimes people think the photographer does it all and the model does nothing. That's definitely not true. If you're working with a portrait client who doesn't take pictures professionally as a model, that means that you are going to have to take on a lot of those things, or you're going to have to find an assistant who can take on a lot of those things. But while you're practicing, it sure helps to work with a model to get some good pictures. So you might go out and see if you can find somebody who's experienced at these things. For portraits in particular, I like to tether my camera to a computer, because I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but taking your time and giving yourself the time to stop and review the pictures and zoom in closely, and maybe even go through a checklist where you check the position of the fingers, hair, makeup, just so you don't forget anything, can make a big difference. And tethering to a computer can help because you get to see it on a bigger screen than just the back of the camera. The bigger screen also means you can call over some other people and have them look at it and get a second set of eyes on it. We're just getting started, but I hope at this point in this little mini lecture that you've begun to appreciate that if you really do consider everything that goes into a photo, it's impossible and overwhelming. What if you're a wildlife photographer? It seems pretty simple, right? Wait for the bird to appear and pop your camera up and take some pictures. But it's really not. Wildlife photography can be incredibly overwhelming. And if you look back at your wildlife pictures, you'll probably see some that you screwed up, right? I can't tell you how many times when I've gotten out to the field and gone to take pictures, and I gotten up early in the morning, it's beautiful and the animals are out there, and then, oh my God, my battery is blinking because it's almost out of juice, and I didn't think to bring an extra battery or to charge my batteries. That's kind of information overload. I did a lot of things right, but I forgot one particular thing. So what you might do is you might keep an extra battery in your car, or you might have a checklist, or you might just develop a methodology where every time you put your camera away, you pop the battery back in the charger, and every time you pick up your camera, you pull the battery off and put it back in. I have a saying, which is never close an open door. I will pull the battery out, put it in the charger, but then I'll leave the battery door open. That way I don't walk off with the camera with an empty battery compartment. The same thing applies to the memory card. I also have a methodology with wildlife photography where before I leave the house, I set the camera to shutter priority, auto ISO, continuous focus, continuous high speed shooting, single autofocus point that I can control with a thumbstick. And then I set the shutter speed to 1/2000th or 1/2500th, because those are the settings that I would want if suddenly a bird popped up and was flying at me. That's good for high speed shooting of a moving subject. And that's the kind of thing that might surprise you. So I know some idealistic wildlife photographers might think, oh, I know about camera settings. If a bird pops up, I know to select all these things. But do you? Or is it possible that in the excitement of the moment, of seeing a species you've never seen before, of getting better light than you've ever had, of getting closer than you've ever been before, is it possible in that excitement you might forget just one thing that will end up ruining your photo? Yes, it's very, very possible. And it happens to me all the time, and it happens to everybody that I know all the time, everybody who's realistic and flawed and human. Like I said, you can address this partially with methodology, partially with practice, just doing it over and over again. Another technique might be to literally write down checklists that you follow step by step by step, at least until you've internalized it completely. Another thing to think about with wildlife photography is the exposure, because you can be getting all those things right and have all the settings just fine, but then you end up shooting a dark colored bird against an overcast sky and the picture's wildly overexposed. Or you are shooting white great egret against a very dark river, and the bird will end up being completely overexposed because the camera's metering system will be metering the dark river. And that's the kind of thing where your brain has to be able to adapt to different situations. And the way I approach that is, if I'm shooting a new subject, I just have a little mantra in my head where I think about will the shutter speed freeze the motion? Will the exposure, is the camera going to overexpose this? And then I take a sample shot and I review it. And I use that sort of methodology every single time. And even if I feel confident, I don't trust myself. I review the picture, I zoom into 1:1, and I check for some problems, and then I go back to shooting. Drones. If you ever fly drones, information overload is incredibly difficult to deal with. Right away, the FAA in the US, pretty much everywhere, you're required to keep visual line of sight with your drone. You have to watch it so that you don't crash into a person or an airplane that flies out of nowhere or a building or something, right? But how on earth do you keep your eye on a drone but also look at the screen so that you can compose the photo or shot? It is literally impossible. There is no way to take photos or videos with a drone without immediately suffering from information overload, because trying to track a drone and look at the screen is impossible. I don't care how idealistic you are, you can't do both things. So how do you deal with that? You could use a visual observer, what the FAA terms a visual observer, which is a second person whose job it is just to stare at the drone. Some drones, like the high-end DJI Inspire, their Pro model, allow you to hook up two separate controllers, and one person controls the drone and the other person controls the camera. And the reason people will spend $10K on a setup like that for a drone over $1,000 Phantom is information overload. You are able to divide the task between two separate people. Two people can handle twice as much information. Having one person dedicated to flying and one person dedicated to shooting will produce better results. And it's a technique that most pro shops will rely on because they're realistic, because they know they can't go just putting everything on one person. And if you are a drone pilot and somehow you can manage to keep one eye on the drone and one eye on the composition, how are you managing to deal with all the camera settings? You still have to deal with aperture, shutter speed, ISO. You have to deal with the exposure compensation in really high contrast situations where you're often shooting a bright sky and the ground at the same time. The drone is moving potentially miles, where lighting conditions could vary dramatically. How on earth are you managing to handle all of that? And the simple answer is you can't necessarily. And most drone pilots will end up just using automatic settings. I know it's not ideal, but that's one of the techniques that you can use to deal with information overload, is to let the camera do some of the work. We'll review that in just a minute. Let's talk about it for landscape photographers. People think landscape photography is this really laid back thing where you can just go out and spend hours and take your time and there's no need to rush and just set up a tripod and do everything right. And sometimes that can be the case. But for me, the best landscape shots are taken at sunrise or sunset. And at sunrise and sunset, time is so fleeting. A few seconds or even a fraction of a second can pretty dramatically change a landscape as a cloud passes in front of a sun, or the sun peeks out behind a mountain or a tree. And the picture you take 1 second might be significantly better or worse than the picture you take another second. And your job is to get the very best picture possible. At the same time, moving the camera to the right or to the left a few feet, or maybe moving it closer to the ground to bring something in the foreground, this will dramatically change the composition and can make the picture much better or much worse. So how are you dealing with all of this? And camera settings with landscape photography can actually be really challenging, because higher f-stop numbers will give you more depth of field, but higher f-stop numbers also generally reduce the sharpness because of diffraction. So you're thinking about your aperture, and you're trying to maximize the sharpness of the entire scene. Are you getting more sharpness by increasing the depth of field, or is the penalty of diffraction actually reducing the overall sharpness of your image? And how can you possibly handle that while the sun is constantly shifting? Like literally every second might require you to change your composition somewhere else. I've found myself shooting landscape photography literally running from one place to another to suddenly find a different composition that now works better because the sun popped out behind a tree and what I was shooting is now in shade or is now in light, and that has dramatically changed it. And of course, you're trying to maximize the data that your camera is capturing. You're probably shooting using the histogram and using techniques like expose to the right. You're probably making sure that you're using the lowest possible ISO, but is your shutter speed getting so slow that leaves blowing in the wind are going to be noticeably blurred and distracting? That's one of the things you kind of have to deal with. You have to make this decision to use a higher ISO and reduce the overall quality of the image, but freeze the leaves a little bit more, or use a lower ISO and show that extra movement, which might be distracting. It might actually detract from the image. It's too much to take on, right? It can seem really difficult. You might have to look at the histogram and decide, oh, I need to bracket, take multiple shots so that I have the option of stacking them together later. But on the same time, bracketing will waste some of your time because it will triple the amount of time that you're shooting. And maybe it's better to take a single photo and give yourself more time to move on to the next scene, because maybe you're going to benefit by shooting more different compositions or moving your camera around a little bit. That is too much to take on. So how can you deal with this? Well, you can plan your shots out beforehand. You can bring your camera and a tripod and get your compositions just right. I have an app on my phone called Sunseeker, which uses augmented reality to show me where the sun and the moon will be at different times of day. So I could show up at a site at noon and hold my phone up, and it will show me that the sun is going to fall on this particular part of the horizon at this particular time of day. And not only is that good for planning, but I can kind of visualize in my head where shadows are going to be falling. If you're working near big cities, Google Earth has 3D maps of big cities, and you can change the time of day in Google Earth, and it will actually show you where the sun is going to hit the buildings and show you the shadows. So this allows you to make some of those choices ahead of time. You can decide you're going to put your camera here with this log in the foreground and use f8. And then when you get there and the sun is rapidly changing, you know what you're going to do, and you can dedicate the remaining brain power that you have to actually composing the shot, making sure you don't screw anything up, and watching the sun and the light and the moving clouds and kind of making decisions. And you don't necessarily have to worry about those other things. And again, sometimes just your camera's automatic settings will make life easier. Sometimes I will bracket just because I don't have time to make sure that I nail the exposure. And by taking 3 shots bracketed, I'll know that one of them is going to be right, and That's one less thing that I have to think about. That allows me to focus on more creative aspects of the landscape, because I've acknowledged to myself that my brain has limits, that information will be overloaded, and that it's okay for me to give some of the hard tasks over to the camera, because it allows me to focus my energy elsewhere. And maybe in another 10 years, maybe with enough practice, I'll be at the point where I can handle all of this in real time. But right now, I still sometimes find myself overloaded with landscape photography. It can also help just to comfort yourself, because sometimes I get stressed. Like, there'll be a beautiful moment and I'll be so anxious about ruining the shot that it will actually screw me up. Tell yourself, if you blow it, it's okay, because you can revisit the location and the light might be better next time, in fact. So don't feel too stressed about it, because nobody is perfect and everybody is going to be messed up. What about for video? Video can be extremely overwhelming, because all these elements we've talked about with still photography are there, but also you have movement. Things are changing over the time. The camera might be changing over time. Literally in a single scene, you might go from bright light to dark shadow. And sound, of course, right? Sound? Oh my God. And that's why for every major TV or film production, you don't just have one cameraman who deals with everything. You have a camera operator who's running the camera, but then you have a sound guy whose job it is to only make sure that the sound is being captured. And then you have a director of photography who is making sure that the camera angles are great and the lighting is great. Then you have an actual director who's making sure that the story goes okay. So if you're one person and you're trying to do all of that, of course you have information overload. If you think the people making Hollywood films, the most experienced people in the world, decide that they need to split these tasks up and delegate them between different people, how can you possibly expect yourself to do all of these things? Now, you can do it all yourself, and many people do. Most YouTubers do it all themselves, but they're making serious compromises, right? Because it is too much for one person to take on. If they were to divide it up, they would get better results. If you decide to take on information overload and do everything all at once, you are giving something up. You will be producing lower quality results. The penalty here is going to diminish over time. And again, I've given you some techniques like checklists, practice, methodology, planning that can help to offset it. But as a human being, if you are a human being, you can only take on so much, because none of us are perfect. So let's review some techniques for minimizing this powerful impact of information overload. And the first up is practice, and experience. If you're going to shoot a professional portrait, practice first. Get your dog, get your sister, get a foam head on a stick, put a wig on it, practice and get accustomed to all the different things that you need to deal with, because at some point, once it becomes second nature, your hands will just move and it will just adjust the aperture without you even consciously thinking about it. And once you can handle all that stuff unconsciously, this means now you can consciously speak to the person that you're photographing. You can tell them little jokes. You can get them comfortable. And now you'll be able to pull out genuine expressions and emotions, and you can build a rapport. Because as a portrait photographer, if your brain is obsessed with dealing with all these technical factors like hair and makeup, guess what? You're not going to be able to really build that rapport. So practice can really help with that. Like I said, let the camera do some work. If you're feeling overloaded, if you're juggling too many items, you need to put one of those items down. And one of the easiest things to put down is camera settings. You can just say, you know what? I'd rather be in manual mode, but it's more important to me that I be able to speak and build a rapport with my subject than it is to make sure that I'm getting the optimal ISO or the optimal shutter speed. Those things won't make a huge difference in the picture, but the person's natural expression is going to make a bigger difference. So for right now, for where I am in this headspace, I'm going to decide to let the camera do some work. Again, some of you are perfect and you can handle all this and you can be incredibly witty and charming while you do it. But for some of you, it's going to be smart to put the camera into auto mode, use auto ISO, something like that. Also, give yourself some time. Don't try to do a portrait shoot in 15 minutes. Give yourself an hour and tell the person to be there an hour, and show up a little early and make sure you get everything ready and take some test shots early. You can always cut out before the end of it if you're done. Same thing with landscape photography. Give yourself some time. Show up half an hour before you think the light is going to be the best, and bring some headphones and a podcast and just hang out, just in case everything goes great, so that you won't be rushed. You can test your shots, get your tripod set up, find the optimal f-stop that you're going to use. Give yourself some time afterwards too to just review your photos, make sure you've nailed everything. Give yourself a few minutes to just zoom in to one and make sure you got everything while you still have the opportunity to reshoot. Because it's in those moments of rest when your brain will be able to process the extra information that was overwhelming to it when you had your eye to the viewfinder. And this suggestion comes from my own cameraman, Justin, which is do one thing at a time. Don't try to handle all the camera settings in the story. Just tell yourself, at this moment, I'm dealing with the camera settings. I'm making sure my memory card is empty. I'm making sure that I have plenty of batteries. And then you can deal with building a rapport, dealing with the composition. Otherwise, it will definitely become overwhelming. Next, make checklists for yourself. The checklist is going to be very different for individual people, but make your checklist that says, do my memory cards have enough space? Is my battery charged? Are my camera settings okay? Should I lower the camera and get closer to the ground? Is this the optimal time of day? Is there a better angle? Is my f-stop optimal? Because you cannot rely on memory to pull up every one of those things. With practice, if you use checklists, you will internalize it all. But even then, I find that one little distraction can throw me off. For example, when I get in my car, I will usually plug my phone in so it can charge. And then when I get out of the car, I grab my phone. But the other day, this very simple task of turning the car off, grabbing my phone, getting out of the car, got interrupted. I went to get out of my car. I saw somebody walking behind my car in the rearview mirror. I briefly thought about that person. I got out of my car and I left my phone in my car. Any kind of little interruption can throw off your routine. So I don't think anybody's ever too experienced to use a checklist. As long as you acknowledge that you're a fallible human, checklists are a good way to kind of offset that. And finally, I know it's not an option for everybody, but when you can, use an assistant. If you travel with your wife or your kid, have them help out. Get them to double check things. Get them to look at the pictures. Assign them the task of being like, hey, just make sure their shirt doesn't get wrinkled. When they get here, when the model gets here, would you just look at their outfit and make sure that it doesn't have our dog hair on it? Dog hair is a real problem in my household. Two minds are better than one, and two minds can handle twice as much information as one. And like I said, if it's a Hollywood production, they will have a dozen minds there just to divide the information between all those people, because even the greatest pros in the world get overloaded. I hope this helps. I haven't ever seen anybody else talk about information overload, but I think it's one of the greatest challenges in photography. Thanks for watching.